it's for years now we're talking about the pressures that farmers are facing, with so many farmers not able to just do farming, so many have to take on a second job. So, like, what are we doing to protect farmers' jobs in Ireland?
Yeah, well, it's been a really challenging number of months, and it was already difficult in terms of we'd seen some rises. The energy rises, for example, the end of last year and the start of this year had impacted in relation to fertiliser prices in particular, but the invasion of Ukraine has changed the scene dramatically, and that has really put a lot of pressure on cost inputs for farmers, so particularly in relation to grain prices, and security around grain for the year ahead as well is a concern, and also then in relation to fertiliser prices. So from a government point of view, I've come forward with a number of supports to support farmers through this time. So, for example, given the challenges in terms of grain supply, I've introduced a tillage scheme to incentivise additional tillage growing this year, and the farmers
responded strongly. And how has that been taken up? Because it is, like, Ukraine on Wednesday, they banned, the exporting of rye, salt, meat. Like, they're not exporting that at all anymore. And to try to get people to change and go, OK, can you start telling these sort of things so that we can, eat and stuff? It's a lot to ask.
You can only do so much in a certain level of time, but I mean the objective and the mission I have been on is to try and do as much as we possibly can this year in relation to grow or increasing the level of area under grain. So I also established a National Fodder and Food Security Committee under the chairmanship of Mike McGann and Frank O'Mara from Chuggas, bringing all of the key farming representatives together to manage the situation, because the real thing and the real message I had was that it's not just about planning for the next few months ahead, it's about taking a 14-month horizon, looking at next winter, looking at next spring, making sure we're fodder and food secure for that level of time. But alongside the feedback from them is that potentially we hope to see between a 5 and 10% increase in relation to tillage and grain domestically this year, which would be a really good response. Now,
it's interesting to hear you say, like, you can only do so much.
Yeah.
Because the government, I mean, you have announced 12 million crop growing scheme in April, 15 million package pig and horticulture, 55 million on silage. But you can only do so much. But the farmers are saying it's not enough. So do you worry that farmers are going to have to stop
as more and more people leave the industry? Because, like, what are we going to do?
What can you do? And it's such a big part of this country. And when farmers are saying that they can't make ends meet anymore.
Yeah, well, I think farmers are responding very strongly. I mean, agriculture and farmers and family farms there's always challenges, and always has been challenges, and they've always stepped up to it. Thankfully, we have seen prices at farm gate level increase this year, and also not in all sectors has it met the increased cost, and that's why I've come forward with certain supports, and I've targeted those government supports at the areas that most needed, and indeed the tasks that we most need to focus on this year. So I've just mentioned the tillage and the grain, which farmers have responded strongly to, but that €55 million to support fodder making, silage and hay making this year has seen farmers respond very strongly to that as well, because the point I've made is, particularly given that grain is, there's challenges around the absolute security of it next winter and spring. The thing we really do well, and which our family farm model is based on, and which makes us such a tremendous food-producing nation, is growing grass and grass-based food production. So there needs to be a big focus, and farmers are very much focusing on producing that grass over the summer, but also in terms of making preparations for next winter.
What about fertiliser then? Because when we're seeing components of that are going to 400%.
Yeah.
We're seeing a lot of farmers are dropping down to 20% usage on fertiliser because they just can't afford it.
Yeah, and that's why I introduced the €1,000 per farm fodder support scheme, to recognise the fact that fertiliser costs have gone up, and to support farmers in relation to helping to meet those costs. It certainly won't cover the full cost of that, but it is a significant contribution.
Should we bring that production into Ireland? It's something that got stopped, producing our own fertiliser here?
What we really need to do, and what I'm also supporting, is a transition away from chemical fertiliser and focusing more on how we can actually grow grass and grow crops without the same demand for fertiliser. And I think this year, particularly when we've seen, because most of our fertiliser production actually comes from Russia, and also it's really energy dependent. So if the price of gas and oil goes up, fertiliser goes up. But what we need to do, and what we've great potential in, is moving to more a different type of grass production, which is based on clover and multi-species sward, and which naturally, through those plants, actually fixes nitrogen in the soil and significantly reduces the level of fertilisers required. And I've introduced schemes this year as well to incentivise farmers to go in that direction. And we're seeing a very significant uptake in that. And that really is the future here.
And to move away from chemical fertiliser is something that is incredibly important when we see the runoff that's going into our rivers, our lakes and the sea. And of course, that brings us around to climate change and what's going on. Like if we're talking about a 50% reduction in in farming output in methane and everything by 2030. Now yourself and Eamon Ryan are not on the same page about this, about how we can reduce the climate emissions from farming in 8 years, are you?
No, well, I think across the government, first of all, we're all on the same page in relation to the fact that we need to reduce our emissions. And it has to be the top priority for government, and indeed it has to be the top priority for governments right around the world. Unfortunately, it hasn't been over the last number of years, but everyone needs to start delivering. And that's why at national level here, we have put in place in legislation a 51% economy-wide reduction in emissions by 2030. Now, that varies then from sector to sector. So in terms of the sectoral targets put forward as part of the Climate Action Plan recently, it indicates a range of reductions for agriculture of between 22 to 30%. Yeah. So, but the key objective here is to reduce.
Is that possible?
Is that possible?
It's really challenging, but it is possible. And certainly the key objective I have and have had.
How would you go around doing that?
Well, I just discussed there, for example, earlier the move to multi-species sward and clover, and reducing the need for chemical fertiliser is something that can make a real difference. Also,
the national herd.
Well, what we're doing is we're putting very significant research and investment into genetic and breeding. So, for example, over the last 20, 30 years, we've seen massive improvements in relation to the productivity of individual animals. So cows, in terms of milking, for example, have doubled their milk growth because of the way we have bred for those qualities.
So less but more efficient cows?
Yes, absolutely. So, like, for example, the trials, and we're investing significantly with Chuggask, our national research body at the moment, but the evidence and the research they're doing shows that different individual animals, produce different levels of emissions. Anything up to 30% emissions from different animals that perform the same from a food production point of view, but have different emissions levels. So we're going to start programming that into our breeding factors over the years ahead. Also, we're seeing new products coming in the market too, for example, in relation to feed additives, whereby by adding certain products to the feed that animals are getting, that it also reduces the emissions from animals.
And science is going to be incredibly important in all of this. But I'm just wondering, are you, because I read so many things, younger farmers who want to try everything and realise they don't want to be using chemical fertiliser. And then kind of older farmers and people who are at the pin of their collar going, well, I can't afford to do these things. Do you think you're bringing the farming community along with you when it comes to the reduction of emissions? Or are some of them going, what are you on about? Like, this is... because this has to be done holistically.
Yeah, it does. And I think it is a challenging time, and it's a time of change. But I think farmers are up for that at the same time. And it's really important that we do work closely with them. And the challenge here is not to reduce the amount of food that we produce, because that's really important. And the world population is growing all the time. And indeed, the other impact of climate change is it means that other parts of the world which are more climate insecure are facing the real challenges now of it being harder to produce food. So it's really important we continue to produce that food. 90% of the food we actually produce is exported, so we play a really important role. But the key thing is reducing the emissions of how we produce it, not reducing food production.
And also, food production is important, but food waste is something that you're really focusing on as well at the moment, because incredibly, 1 million tonnes of food waste here in Ireland every year.
Absolutely. I mean, it's terrible to think, that for all the work that our family farms do right across the country and the hard work, time, effort and resources that goes into that, and indeed energy from farmers, but also energy in terms of resources and inputs, that ultimately 1/3 of all that food that is produced actually gets wasted and doesn't end up on somebody's plate and being consumed. And that's something that is a big bugbear of mine and something that I've really, as Minister for Agriculture and Food and the Marine, and working with farmers in terms of all of the great work they do, I want to ensure that that actually ends up having a real benefit. And it costs about 1/3 of our total food waste actually comes from households. The other 2/3 are in different parts of the supply and retail chain. But for example, for your average household, it costs your average household €700 a year in terms of wasted food.
Oh yeah.
So and also
the cost of living crisis. Do you think that the EU have to get together then, because below market selling when it comes to supermarkets, that's a big issue. So people are buying they're buying stuff and it's like, well, sure, it doesn't cost that much. So, I'm going to have, and we're throwing it all away. Like, is that something that the EU have to come together?
Yeah, I think it's about creating a respect for food, that we shouldn't waste any of it, but also just creating an awareness around how much we waste. Because I don't think your average person doesn't realise in terms of our day-to-day living how it all adds up. And I think, this week we have National Food Recycling Week, which is led out by Minister Ossian Smith and the Department of Energy, Climate and Communications. And then at different times of the year, I run campaigns through my department as well. But the key focus here is to actually get the message across to everyone that we all have to play a role. And if we all come together, we can make a real difference in that regard in terms of the environment, but also in terms of our own pocket. And today, actually, I'm announcing €200,000 funding from my department towards specific projects across the country, which are working in that space and are trying to make a difference in that space.
You're trying to make a difference, and we can see the government are doing their best. But are you concerned when you see in the latest Red C poll in the Business Post, Sinn Féin have now got more popularity than Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael put together? As a party member who is trying to do their best, are you concerned that you're just not getting the support at the moment that we're seeing from the other side?
Not particularly, Tommy. I'm a very proud member of Fianna Fáil, and it's a party which really focuses on trying to better people's lives and support people in times of need as well. And polls go up and go down and do change. And I remember back before...
It's only going one way at the moment.
Well, at the moment is a key word there. And I remember back before the last election, 4 weeks out from the election campaign, the support of my party was projected to be much, much stronger than it ended up in the election. We still ended up as having the largest number of seats, but it was going to be higher. I remember if you go back 3 or 4 months before that election campaign, Sinn Féin, for example, were dropping candidates from their tickets across the country because they were concerned about what their vote was going to be and that they might lose seats. So it changes in 3, 4, 5 weeks potentially.
So you're hoping to make a late run?
The key focus always has to be on working to support the public and on doing a good job in government. And then and over time then it's up to the public to decide and make their decisions in terms of who's best placed to continue for further terms after that. And I think as a government we're working very coherently. The three parties are working very coherently.
Well, coherently is interesting because I suppose there's been a mess up over the box. It wasn't, we're like, it was a communications disaster. And now all of a sudden we've got people who want to go on their first holiday in 3 years. And the airports are a nightmare. Like, surely around the cabinet table you're going, lads, what the hell is going on? And that is causing a lot of frustration.
There is challenges every day, without a doubt, and it's the role of government to do all it can to work to support the public. And I think the point I'm making is that I think the three parties are working really well together to actually do that. But there are challenges there, and you mentioned the airport as a really, really big difficulty at the moment, and it's simply unacceptable what has happened there over the last number of weeks, and particularly last weekend. Dublin Airport Authority had a really strong track record and tradition of providing a strong service and management of the airport. They have failed the public really badly over the last number of weeks, and it needs to be addressed immediately. I know Minister for Transport Eamon Ryan and Junior Minister Hildegard Naughton held meetings with the management yesterday, and will be meeting them again today. We need to see that sorted out.
I mean, it's a poor picture and reflection.
They need to do their job in that regard, because we can't. Those scenes we saw over last weekend are unacceptable, and we'll do all we can as a government to support them in resolving that.
Minister Charlie McConalogue, Alcor Minister for Agriculture, Food and the Marine Marine. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.